Okay, welcome. This is Rabbi Tobin at B'nai Shalom in West Orange, and we are back to every Monday Talmud Mondays. We're probably not going to miss one, God willing, until winter break. There will be one there when the world takes the week off. We are in chapter 3 of Sanhedrin. I know we started with Mishnah, we're leaving Mishnah behind. We're going to actually start the Talmud. And the idea here is we are in a chapter that talks about courts, specifically in monetary matters. It talks about how you put together a Beit Din of 3 rabbis to decide your case. So there's a bunch of things that happens here that really is unique to how we understand Talmud as an historical document that is in development, that is in flow. There's really 2 ways to read Talmud. Welcome, everyone. There's packets here for you to pick up along the way, just one. There's 2 ways that people study Talmud. One is they just read straight through as if everybody on the page is sitting in the room together, and they're arguing with each other, and they come up with what the halacha is, and that may or may not have gotten updated by subsequent tradition for very good reasons, as rabbis taught rabbis over the years, and then you have your rabbi today. But we all go back to the Talmud to understand where the halacha, the Jewish law on any particular topic, came from, and we don't venture far away from it. That's kind of the straight traditionalist mode of reading Talmud, and that's kind of how we'll read, but then we'll pause, and I'm going to do something else that usually you will not be exposed to in that kind of a setting, and that is I'm going to say, who are the people who are talking to each other on the page? And we're going to find that it is impossible for these people to actually be talking to each other. And we need to understand what the Talmud truly is, which is a compiled document of crafted, and I'll use the word, though it sounds like it's pejorative, it's not, artificial constructed arguments, where you took different people's point of views from different times and places, and you put them together as if they're talking to each other. And that's actually a really good and a really important thing for us to do as Talmud students, because otherwise you'll have somebody in Eretz Yisrael in the 2nd century saying one thing, and somebody in Babylonia in the 5th century saying something else, and you would just say, okay, the halacha is completely different because it's a different time and place. And while the halacha does become different in different times and places, because of the times and places people are in, that's not what you do. You don't say, and therefore they have nothing to do with each other. So you have to put them together and say, what was the operating principle behind guy number 1, and the operating principle behind guy number 2, and then say if the operating principle is the same, it's the time and place that resulted in the difference. Or you could say they have a different operating principle. And even if one had been in the other's time and place, he would have had this disagreement. Right? That's an important thing to know if you get into the business of trying to figure out what the halacha is supposed to be here today. Because either you're going to say that Rav's principle applies today, or you're going to say, and therefore it should be the way he said, or you're going to say Rav's principle doesn't apply in this time and place, somebody else's principle applies in this time and place. And that's how we figure things out. So this chapter is a great example of that crafting of Talmudic arguments, and you're really going to start to see that today and next week as we go through this. But first we have to do it keep shuto, we have to do it bikiyut, we have to just kind of run through a page or so here and understand the arguments, because they are not exactly intuitive. So let's start with the Mishnah. We studied this Mishnah. We are, by the way, the text that we're working from is the Schottenstein edition of the Gemara by ArtScroll. We are not selling these copies or publishing them on the web. We are following them in our own study. That's the copyright disclaimer, right? All right, legitimate use, just educational. So the photocopy is page 23A. It says Mishnah, the very first page. You have a cover page and then a page. It's the back of the cover page where it says Mishnah. These photocopies will be excellent because I didn't do them. So all the pages will run in order and none of the words will be cut off. Okay, 23a. Now, the Schottenstein edition of the Talmud is published for exactly this kind of study. That is to say, it's going to give you a few Hebrew words in bold print, followed by a couple of English words in bold print, and a bunch of English words not in bold print thrown in among the English words in bold print. So, for example, if you look, it says chapter 3 Mishnah, and it says, Dinei Mamonot b'shlosha, monetary cases, now not bold print, are judged. Bold print by, not bold print, a court of, bold print 3. Do you see that in the typesetting? What they're doing is they're telling you that the bold print English words are the words that are in the Mishnah. And the non-bold print English words are the words that are not in the Mishnah, but are necessary for you to understand are part of the point, otherwise you won't understand the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says monetary cases by 3. This selects for himself 1, that selects for himself 1, the words of Rabbi Meir. What I did is I just read only the bold print English. Let's do that again. Only the bold print English goes like this. Monetary cases by 3, this selects for himself 1, that selects for himself 1, and both select for themselves 1 more, the words of Rabbi Meir. You see that?
Yep.
Without the small, non-bold print English words, you will be at a loss. Okay? So filling it in, the Schottenstein, 99% of the time at this level, they're following the commentary of Rashi. So it's according to Rashi, the Mishnah according to Rashi. So the Schottenstein says, well, this is what it really means. Monetary cases are judged by a court of 3. How are the judges chosen? This litigant selects for himself 1, and that litigant selects for himself 1, and both litigants together select for themselves 1 more. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Does that make more sense?
Yes. We studied that.
We did study that, because we started with Mishnah.
Where do they take them from? The Sanhedrin?
Where do they get the judges?
Yeah.
The judges, that's a good question. Where do they get the judges from? The Mishnah doesn't tell you. The Mishnah presumes that you know that they are known to be judges. They are qualified, trained, ordained, appointed judges.
Not from the Sanhedrin? They're not part of
They
the
might be part of the Sanhedrin, but you don't live near the Sanhedrin. You live in Chutzaplatz in southern Ephraim, and you have a little Beit Din in town, like traffic court in West Orange, right? The judge is a judge, with all the rights and responsibilities and training of a judge, unless it's somebody who just won an election and doesn't know anything, right? But you have judges in all kinds of levels. So monetary matters are in a court of 3 judges. It's the lowest level court in the land, and there would have been these tribunals everywhere in every town, okay?
In every town.
In every town. And because the courts open every day and people had other jobs, there were probably more than 3 judges in every town. So if it met on Wednesday, you had 3, these 3, on Tuesday, those 3. If somebody had a wedding, somebody subbed, it was another 3. So who were the 3 specifically was not preordained. So these litigants need a court. So they have to put the court together from the judges that are in town. So let's say the case is me and Stuart, okay? Stuart was kind enough to lend me what our president calls a small loan of $1 million, right? My father gave me a small loan just to start of only $1 million, right? And then I gave it back. It's a small loan. So Stuart, you lent me $1 million. I appreciate it. I haven't paid you back, and you want to get the money from me. So he's what we call the malveh, the loaner, and I'm the loveh, the borrower or the debtor. And he wants to take me into court
Because you're not paying.
because I haven't paid. So how are we going to get a court, right? So you have to put a court together out of the judges who are in town. He picks a judge, I pick a judge, and together we pick the 3rd judge.
Right.
Why?
That takes a lot of agreeing.
Right. It takes a lot of agreeing, right? What are the problems with that system?
May not
They
Go
don't
to a
agree
third
on a
judge.
judge.
Yeah, what if I don't ever have to get forced to pay him back if I never agree on the third judge? No, he's no good. No, he's no good. No, he's no
They can
good.
go to another town.
It doesn't say that here. So these are the kinds of questions that the Gemara, the Talmud study of the Mishnah, has to ask and answer. The problem with Schottenstein and Rashi is they've made it too easy on you. They have actually put words in here that are not in the Mishnah that only make sense after the next several pages have been argued and resolved. As we're going to see, the first question or the first thing that Gemara deals with does not assume that this is what this means. It assumes that this actually means something quite different. We're assuming that this one picks one and this one picks one and these two pick a third means he and I are picking individual judges. What are the other possibilities? He and I pick a judge and the two judges pick the third judge. That's a possibility. Another possibility is he and I each pick our own court. It doesn't say a judge. This one picks one and this one picks one. Might be one court.
That's what the Gemara says. Each
Right.
selects a court of three.
Well, okay. So these are possible ways, completely different ways to understand it. Now, in response to the words of Rabbi Meir, the Chachamim Omrim, Shnei Dayanim Borerin Lahem Od Echad. The two judges select for themselves the one more. So that's the Chachamim against Rabbi Meir. And remember, our general principle is Rabbi Meir against an individual, Rabbi Meir wins. Rabbi Meir against the Chachamim win. So presumably this is how the halacha will turn out. But never mind. And then we have Zeh posel dayano shel zeh, v'zeh posel dayano shel zeh. I can rule out your judge, and you can rule out my judge. I have the ability to declare that judge unfit. Well, that makes no sense, right? And this is Divrei Rabbi Meir, again, the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say, wait a minute, Ematai, when? I mean, because otherwise, again, I'll always rule out his judge. Therefore, the two judges never get to choose the third judge. Therefore, there will never be a court, and I will never be forced to pay him back his money.
Is there a time limit?
So that can't possibly be the system. It doesn't say anything about a time limit. So that can't be what it means. So the sages come in, they say, that's ridiculous. So when can, because Rabbi Meir is not an idiot, they have to respect him, under what circumstances can I declare his judge to be posel, to be unfit? Well, it's bisman shemevi alehem ra'aya, it's the time that I bring proof against them, shehem krovim or psulim, that they are either relatives to one of us, and therefore they're disqualified automatically, or they're pasulim themselves. This is an inherently unfit judge for the bench because of something. He's an adulterer, he's a thief, he's a liar, he's a murderer, he's whatever. Right? It doesn't say because when he was 17 he did something bad. He himself is unfit for some reason at this time.
Usually, he charges a lot of interest.
Okay? Something like that. Aval, im hayu ksherim, but if the judges were kosher, o mumchim, or experts, notice it's or experts, mipi beit din, according to the beit din, they're certified experts, eno yachol lefoslan, you cannot disqualify them. So let's say our case is about Bitcoin. Okay? I don't know anything about Bitcoin. How many of you know anything about Bitcoin?
I've heard of it.
Okay, Ron has gone and taught himself about Bitcoin. So he knows something, he's heard of it, right? So if we have a lawsuit because he and I have something in Bitcoin, and we're trying, and normal treasury bonds and dollars are not applicable, which means all the precedent law is not applicable. You need to bring in a court that is an expert on Bitcoins.
What could happen, for example, is that you borrowed your $1 million, but now it's worth $5 million
Uh-huh.
because Bitcoin's value.
I don't want to give him back the Bitcoins that I borrowed from him because now the Bitcoins are worth $5 million. I only want to give him $1 million in dollars. I don't want to give him the Bitcoins back, right? Because it was $1 million loan, it wasn't a Bitcoin loan, but he paid me in Bitcoin, which still exists, and now it's worth more. That could be the case. So some expert judge in Bitcoin would be the perfect person to have in the Beit Din. What if it's Stuart's first cousin? Or his wife? I would, well, that's not a kosher witness because they're krovim. So according to the Chachamim, I can be posel that person. I can declare that person pasul, unfit to be a judge for this case because but this says or. If they're kosher or they are experts. So if his wife is a world expert judge in Bitcoin, I cannot declare her unfit for the case.
You can't have a woman back in those days who was not eligible to be.
I did that on purpose.
Okay.
to say that women can be judges. They didn't have judges who were women then. There's no reason a woman can't be a judge today. All right, so let's kind of just go with that. All right? Yes.
How would this thing rule on the Judge Kavanaugh case?
Kavanaugh's not here. I was poking fun at the 17-year-old misbehavior.
How would they, how would
It doesn't apply.
theory?
This theory does not apply to Kavanaugh.
When we're talking about judges, and sometimes it seems like our terms are.
Well, no, I'm sorry. This theory would apply to Kavanaugh had he been convicted of some crime that rendered him unfit to the bench, right? So if he was convicted whatever, then this would apply. He would not be allowed to sit as a judge on the bench.
We have jurors and witnesses, and it sounds like when we're talking about judges, they're both a judge, a juror, and a witness.
Okay, in American law, we have judge, juror, and witnesses. We also have prosecuting attorney and defense attorney. In the rabbinic system, the judges are the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, and the defense.
Right.
The Beit Din is all of those things, and they take in testimony, and then they rule. And they cross-examine,
And the rule is binding?
binding.
How can they force it? How do they enforce it?
They enforced it by enforcing it. If it was a capital case, they killed the person. If it was a monetary case, they forced him to pay the money. If it was a punishment case, they would tie him to a post and flog him 50 beatings with a lash. They enforced it. They had the power to enforce. They held the person in custody until the justice had been meted out. And it was done right away. It was, no, they held the person in custody. They literally held the person in custody and got the money from him. They didn't have like jails to put them in, right?
In the Orthodox community, they still go to the rabbinic.
You can still have a Beit Din. The system, but in American law, to go to a Beit Din and have it be binding, both parties have to agree to allow the Beit Din to be binding, right? And to waive their rights in civil court. So it's technically
You can
arbitration.
do that in a civil case, obviously, but not in a criminal case.
No, if it's a murder case, the state has an interest in prosecuting. That's
No,
right.
I'm
This-
talking civil
Yeah,
money.
you couldn't go to the civil court and say, we already tried it in a Beit Din and found him not guilty. They're not going to care.
Okay.
Okay. All right, very good. So anything that you can do binding arbitration, you could have a Beit Din today. Okay. Now, finally, the Mishnah ends with Zeposel Edav Shel Zeh, Zeposel Edav Shel Zeh. They can also declare unfit each other's witnesses. Divrei Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Meir. And the Chachamim come in and they say, Chachamim Amtei Matai, same question, when and why. Bizman shemevi alehem ra'ayah, in a time that he can bring proof, Shem Krovim Aposlim, that Psulim, that they are relatives or they are unfit witnesses. Aval im hayu kasherim eno yachol lefoslan. But if they're kosher, you can't eliminate them. Okay? So that's the Mishnah.
Can a relative be kosher?
A relative cannot be kosher according to this, let me be very careful. If the witness is a relative, someone has the right to declare them unfit,
Even if they were actually a witness to the.
even if they were a witness to the whatever.
Or they're an expert.
If they are an expert, the language of the Mishnah seems to say they cannot be declared unfit, even if they are a relative.
Really?
That's how I read the simple sense of the Mishnah. The Gemara is not going to leave that alone. The Gemara is going to dig at all of this stuff in ways you've never imagined, right? And try and figure all this out. Obviously, this is an important chapter because there were times that Jews had authority from the secular rulers to handle these matters according to our own law, right? The Duke of Burgundy didn't want to have the court case between Shmuel and Reuven show up in front of him. Why did he care what the Jews stole from each other, right? So he would give the local Jewish authorities authority to rule over their own internal matters. Just don't bug me with it. And if you bugged him with it and you brought him in, you probably weren't going to like the outcome because they were going to be quite forceful and then they could do whatever they wanted, right? On the other hand, in Spain, we have records of the local Beit Din handing people off to the civilian court for punishments, particularly for capital offenses, because they didn't have the ability to do the Sanhedrin or the court of however many for a blood case, so they would give it to the local duke. And nobody, if you don't want to have your case handed over to the local duke, it's not going to go well for you.
I think this is why on a wedding ketubah, you don't want a family.
On a ketubah, you do not have immediate family members signing on that ketubah, because they're not kosher witnesses. And if you ever needed to contest the ketubah, you could throw the witnesses out, which could throw the marriage out, throw the ketubah out.
If when I'm signing for the gets, I don't
Yes.
do that, but that's just for, if I know someone that the get is going to, do I, am I disqualified?
If you are asked to be a witness on the writing of a get,
Not the get, I guess we don't do gets.
sometimes you do the writing of the get, sometimes you do the appointing of the agent.
Rabbi, the agent.
Okay, so a get has been written, and the shaliach can't get to, Portland, Oregon, to deliver it. So the shaliach comes to Minyan and gathers a little Beit Din of people who are davening every day and says, I need you to be witnesses because I'm appointing a rabbi in Portland to deliver this get for me. And I'm going to read a little proclamation and who the get is for and who the get is from, and that I wrote it, and certain indications and simanim that are written into the document that identify the document that this is in fact the get, in case there's another Reuven who's divorcing another Leah.
So let's say the get.
And all that happens,
My brother,
but you realize that it's to your brother and your brother's soon-to-be ex-wife.
right.
You may not sign. Now, the appointment of the agency, technically, you're not related to the agent or the newly appointed agent, so you can be a witness for that act, but I wouldn't do it if you were a brother to the guy giving the get, right? I would want to make sure that the witnesses on every subsequent appointment of agency were kosher for the original document. That's not absolutely required, but I would really want to keep that neat and clean. Right? Okay, so let's go into the Gemara. Now, what does the Gemara ask first? Don't read the non-bold print, right? It sets you up to know too much. Let yourself suffer for a little while before we solve all the problems. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the Hebrew and the bold print English first, and then go back and figure it out. So, my zebarer lo echad v'zebarer lo echad. The Gemara asks, what is this? Meaning this quote from the Mishnah that says, this one chooses for himself one, this one chooses for himself one. Where's that quote from? First line of the Mishnah. Okay? And the answer is bitlata sage. Or not the answer, but the explanation of why I'm asking the question is, 3 is enough. 3 is enough. 3 is plenty. Tlata sagi, that's Aramaic. By the way, Aramaic, if you want to know, if you want to move between Aramaic and Hebrew, change the taf in Aramaic to a shin in Hebrew. And you get
Change?
that, no, that's not the only change. But there are multiple changes like that where it's simply the flip of a letter. Okay? Shalosh.
Oh, Bishua.
Bishlosha.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay? Bishlosha sagi. Shlosha is plenty. So tlata is Aramaic for shalosh. And an aleph on the end in Aramaic is like a hey on the front in Hebrew. It means the. Okay? All right. So they say, what is this? He gets to pick, he gets to pick. Three's enough. So that makes no sense.
Why?
Because if the Mishnah were, I get to pick one, you get to pick one, we get to pick a third,
Right.
why does it have a problem if it says three is enough? You and I are picking three, so what's the problem?
There is no problem.
So why is it asking a question? It only asks a question if it has a problem. Okay? So we go on, Hachi Kamar. The Gemara, as it tends to do at this level, answers its own question. This is what it's talking about. The kuf on the front of a verb in Aramaic means present tense verb. Ka means whatever the verb is happening right now. So Amar is to speak or to say. Hachi is this. This is kuf Amar, what it is saying. This is what it's saying. Kishehu borer lo beit din echad, v'zeh borer lo beit din echad. Okay? This one picks a whole beit din for himself, and this one picks a whole beit din for himself. Shnehem borerim lahem od echad, and the two of them, and now I don't know if they're talking about the two of them, the litigants, or the two of them, the new beit dins, right? Borerim lahem od echad. The two of them then pick a third. So, what have we come up with in this interpretation? 9. This one picked a Beit Din, this one picked a Beit Din, the two of them agreed on a third Beit Din, now we've got 9 judges among 3 Beit Dins. In which case the argument, Tlata Sage, 3 is enough, makes a lot of sense. So the only way to understand the in what case isn't 3 enough, it would be, if you understand the Mishnah, to be saying that we're actually picking whole Beit Dins, not individual judges. Did it say that?
No.
No. But that's the only thing it could be saying for the objection to make sense. So this is what Gemara is. This is what Talmud is. It's not just raising an objection and explaining it to you. You have to figure out the objection. You have to figure out what are they challenging that would make that objection make sense. Now I know the objection. Does that fit the solution? Okay, now I figured it out. That was their objection.
So how can you possibly try a case in 3 courts? I mean, it's impossible.
That's why you have more Talmud. Because that's not the solution. No sentence of Talmud is ever the solution. Sometimes the objection and the question that's being raised is really dumb. But it's a logical possibility. And the Gemara brings it up to dismiss it.
Okay.
Okay? And that often happens first, because now they're going to bring quotes from a lot of people talking about real things that matter. This one's not given in anybody's name. Nobody is actually attached to the idea of a Beit Din and a Beit Din and a Beit Din. There's no Rebbe Yehuda or something who said this is what they did. Why?
It's absurd.
Because it's absurd. Nobody ever said this.
Good.
But the Gemara is raising the question. So who is the Gemara? The Stam of the Gemara, the anonymous narrator of the Gemara, is the final level of editing. So this is happening in the 5th, 6th, or 7th century of the Common Era, a half a millennium after the Mishnah is written, 2,000 miles away in Babylonia, generations and lifetimes in a different place. Somebody has put all the materials together and is crafting the logical arguments that can be used around this Mishnah. And this one he brings to dismiss rather quickly. Okay? So, what does it mean? This one chooses, and they choose a third. Isn't 3 enough? This is what the Mishnah is saying, that he actually picks a whole Beit Din, and the other one picks a whole Beit Din, and then they pick a third Beit Din. That's the only way that would make sense.
No, I'm missing something.
Yep.
The Mishnah says that are judged by a court of 3.
Yes.
And then it goes on, how are they selected?
Yes.
Where did we get 3 courts from? Where does
The Gemara, he just made that up. He doesn't have a basis
He's
for that.
answering a question, the Gemara's answering a question that was never asked.
Correct. That's why we have Gemara. Gemara asks questions that are not asked in the Mishnah. It asks those questions of the Mishnah, and it brings answers to those questions.
Yeah, but usually there's a relationship to the Mishnah.
There is. The Mishnah says, Ze borer echad v'ze borer echad. This one picks one and this one picks one.
Picks one judge.
It doesn't say that.
Oh, but it does say that.
It doesn't say that.
That's understood. No, I judge by a court of three. Doesn't say three.
The words of Rabbi Meir do never use the
It doesn't
word
use the word shofet, but it's,
or dayan.
okay, I give up.
You're right, but you're wrong,
I know,
right? Your conclusion is correct, but you're skipping a step,
okay.
right? The tooth has to hurt before you take it out. You just don't take teeth out, right? All right, ready?
Yeah.
All right, now, on the right-hand side, in the small print, the Gemara questions the Mishnah's unqualified ruling that any litigant can reject a court selected by his counterpart. So we're going to play with that. Va'afilu lo ve'matzeh me'akev. Can a debtor, can the borrower also prevent, meaning prevent the creditor from picking a court? V'ha'amar Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Elazar said, and it doesn't tell you what he said, and the answer is, Lo shanu elamalve. They only taught what Rabbi Elazar said about the creditor. Aval love, kofimoto, vidam be'iro. They force him, and they litigate it in his hometown court. Okay, so again, you don't have enough information in the bold print words to know what's happening. So we just interpreted the Mishnah as being a court, and a third court. And the Gemara is going to say, okay, in that case, that really doesn't make sense because Rabbi Elazar said something about the borrower, which would contradict that stance. And the answer to that is, Rabbi Elazar, they only taught about the creditor, not the borrower, who can be forced to accept the local court. End of sentence. So now we have to try and figure that out. What's going on here? Okay? So this is another moment where you have to say this is a put together document. Rabbi Elazar teaches 8 pages from now in the Talmud. He hasn't taught it yet. He's being referred to here without quoting him as if you already know what he has taught, which doesn't show up for another 8 pages in the Talmud. So let's stop. How can you reference somebody you haven't taught yet in your argument? How can you reference him and not even quote him and assume that the people know what you're talking about for the point you're trying to make?
Well, it's the narrator, it's the redactor.
It's the narrator. And by his day, everybody has read everything, including 8 pages from now. So all of Talmud is presumed knowledge at every point in Talmud. Wherever you picked up and started reading is irrelevant. For you to understand what's on the page, it is presumed that you have read and understood all 2,556 folio pages of Talmud. And they reserve the right to simply refer to something else without explaining it. And if you don't know it, you got to go look it up. And that takes a long time. Okay? So Rabbi Elazar teaches the following 8 pages from now. He says, when a creditor and a borrower are in litigation, the borrower does not have the right to invalidate the local court.
Meaning the court where the borrower.
The court where they are. Let's assume they're both in the same town. Keep it simple. Okay? So I can't invalidate Stewart's court, and I'm forced into the local court who is going to resolve it right away. He, however, can invalidate my local court and force me to go to another court in another town. And the argument the Gemara has about that is travel expenses. I cannot force him, when he's trying to collect his money back from me, to incur travel expenses because I have no power and authority over him. On the other hand, as the lender, he has power and authority over me, and he can, as if I were his servant, whom he has purchased with this loan, force me to do things against my will. The lender has power over you as if you are an indentured servant back to him. So he can force me to use this court, he can force me to use that court, he can force me to incur travel expenses at my own expense on the way to the other court. He has a certain amount of power and leverage over me.
And this assumes that there's no question, nobody's questioning that he lent you the money and you haven't paid it back.
if that question were raised, they would say, well, he's the Malve and I'm the Love in the case, and in those circumstances, he gets to send me over there. Now, if it turns out that it's false and there never was a loan, I could probably sue him for the travel expenses. Right?
Just for the travel expense?
No, I don't know. What else did he do to me? Did he hurt me? Did he harm me? Did I lose my job? Right? Pain, suffering, and embarrassment?
Now, in the Torah, after 7 years, isn't the,
Loans are supposed to be forgiven in the land of Israel every 7 years. That's correct.
So by the time they
Loans
finish with the
between Jews.
litigation, it's 7 years.
If the
So
court
he
case
doesn't have
takes
to-
too long,
So
yeah.
he doesn't have to pay.
Okay, but that's a different case.
I mean, could he extend it? I don't like this. and-
No, you can't play around like that. You can't play around. They're assuming that we're going to court relatively quickly. Okay, so that's that.
Excuse me, the Mishnah says something that's very simple and clear, and anybody could understand.
And the Gemara is mucking it up.
That's right.
Yes, the Mishnah is absolutely clear. Nobody misunderstood the Mishnah, right? The Gemara is intentionally mucking around in the waters to make it an opportunity to learn other things. If I just said, oh, I know that, then I wouldn't have to know Rabbi Elazar. Now I need to know Rabbi Elazar. Well, Rabbi Elazar has a point. If you can get rid of each other's judges, what if you actually move to another town? Are you allowed to do that? Well, that's not fair, or maybe it is fair. Who has the right to do that? That's a whole other series of things that we get invited into because the Gemara raised the question of courts instead of individual justices. Right? So it was really a way to lead into Rabbi Elazar. So now I ask you the question, who is Rabbi Elazar? This is Elazar ben Azariah, and he is a early level Tana, meaning he is a scholar of the Mishnah. He has the same authority as anyone else in the Mishnah. So if I bring a Rabbi Elazar teaching, even though it's 8 pages from now, that this is what they can do, that means I have to understand the Mishnah according to him, or understand why he doesn't apply to this Mishnah. But I can't discard him. He is the same authority as Mishnah, because he's from the first generation of Tanaim. He saw the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash by the Romans, and you know him from the Haggadah as the young, brilliant guy with the gray hair. I was a man of 20, but I was like a man of 70 and all that. All that story is Elazar. Okay? Elazar ben Azariah. So he's a well-known, authoritative figure, and you have to deal with him. Okay, so now the Gemara answers. What is it answering? It's answering this question of, can you throw out each other's courts? Is this about courts? And is there a difference between the Love and the Malve, according to Rabbi Elazar? And all of this is referring to the Rabbi Meir position in the Mishnah, which loses to the Chachamim. Okay? So we are now talking about Rabbi Elazar on a topic that is a misinterpretation of the part of the Mishnah that will lose anyways.
So it's like appealing the minority opinion in a court. Rabbi Meir is the minority.
Rabbi Meir is like the minority
You
opinion.
indicate the minority.
He has been preserved in the ruling of the court as the minority opinion.
Right.
And perhaps there's something to it, and he lost in this case for a reason we can discern, and therefore preserving him is important for later jurisprudence. Perhaps. Okay, now, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan said, it's Kidda Amar Rabbi Yochanan Ba'arkaot Shebesur Yashanu. So Rabbi Yochanan says, they were really teaching about the courts in Syria. Huh? Right, it's not Bavel, and it's not Eretz Yisrael. To get to the Syria that they're talking about, you have to go up through the Golan Heights to the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where there's pastoral farmland and no major civilization. You have Damascus up there, which is a very small town at this point in history, is barely a Roman outpost. And you go down the rivers to the big civilization in Babylonia, or you go west to the big civilization in Aleppo or Antioch or Turkey or Israel and the Mediterranean coast. right? So there were courts in Syria, and Rabbi Yochanan said that they taught. Who taught? Nope. They taught means the Mishnah taught regarding the courts of Syria. Hachanami barakot besuria shanu. Here also they are talking about the courts of Syria, So, where's there and where's here? Here is the Mishnah. There is Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Yochanan says that there he was talking about the courts of Syria, and here too they're talking about the courts of Syria. Here too what? When we're throwing out courts in favor of other courts. Doesn't that seem like a really stupid practice? That you can throw out a court in favor of another court? So what's he saying? The courts of Syria are not real courts. They can't attract a rabbi to live in their town. It's worse than Topeka. I only say that because I've been to Topeka. Okay? It's worse than Topeka. You cannot attract large numbers of rabbis to come live in Topeka. The Chabad guy in Topeka probably was really badly behaved as a kid, and they sent him to Topeka.
How they decide, eh?
Is there another Jew there?
Probably. Right? So you can't get a Beit Din in Topeka. So you just have guys who maybe have a Torah and are doing their best. In that situation, you can overthrow the Beit Din. In that situation, I can say, Stuart, you are not taking me to Joe the mechanic who's pretending to be the head of the Beit Din in Topeka. We're going to Kansas City because everything's up to date in Kansas City, right? And we're going to go to Kansas City, the big city, and we're going to find a Beit Din there, and it's going to be real. Now, if the case is about a carburetor, then Joe the mechanic, who's the Rosh Beit Din in Topeka, is a mumche. And maybe I can't overthrow it because I stumbled across an actually qualified court. Okay? That's what the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's what the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is talking about. That's what Rabbi Elazar, according to Rabbi Yochanan, was talking about. So who's Rabbi Yochanan?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So they could arbitrarily just throw out a Beit Din if they don't think they're going to be favorable to their position? What's to keep them from doing
There
it?
seems to be no, I can throw your guy out, you can throw my guy out, I can throw your court out, you can throw my court out. The two courts or the two of us then need to find a third court, right? And that court presumably you cannot throw out,
Okay.
all right? So this third, whatever it is, cannot be thrown out. Unless they're posel. Unless they're a relative or a murderer or a philanderer or something like that. They're not kosher. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is a couple of generations after Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but he's still of the age of the Mishnah, and he's still in the land of Israel at the beginning. But he sees the Mishnah written and outlives it. So he dies in the year 279 of the Common Era. The Mishnah is written in the year 200. He's born in about 180. So he lives to be like 100 years old, which in those days is amazing. So Rabbi Yochanan has a profound influence. He is a Tana, because he was young, and he was 20 when the Mishnah was written, so he was probably an ordained rabbi at that point, and he's the last generation of Tanaim of the Mishnah, which kind of makes him an authority on the Mishnah and everything that went before him. Everyone after him is called an Amora, which is a Talmudic sage, rather than a Mishnah sage. And Mishnah is spades in bridge, and Gemara is hearts in bridge. It's a strong trump, it's not the strongest trump. Mishnah wins. Scholars from the Mishnah win. Okay? So Rabbi Yochanan says, oh, that Elazar ben Azariah thing, you know what? That was all about, and what is it? Secular courts. Lousy little local courts. Otherwise, you can't get rid of courts at all, according to Rabbi Yochanan.
Well, he says, as Rabbi Yochanan said, in regard to a different question.
You're reading the notes.
I'm reading from the,
Yes, but you're reading the non-bold print.
oh, sorry.
right? With the non-bold print, the Schottenstein's purpose is to solve all problems before you have them, so you don't worry your little head about it, and you can plow through a whole page front and back of Mishnah in 45 minutes. That's its
I
purpose.
can't plow through a whole page of Anthony Trollope.
It takes me 45 minutes to read the funny pages. All right, so we're not always going to go with what's in the non-bold print.
Okay.
The bold print read by itself is the basis of our conversation. If the small print helps us, fine, but if it solves a problem too quickly, you can't go with it.
Okay, okay.
All right? It's like using Midrash to understand Torah. It may be valid, but let's not let Torah off the hook quite so quick. Right? Okay, now, so, Hachanami Barka'at B'Surya Shanu. Here too, they're referring to the secular courts of Surya. Aval, Mumchim, lo. But if they were experts, no, you can't throw them out. That's Rabbi Yehuda, or Yochanan. Now, Rav Papa Amar, Afilu Tema Mumchim. Well, no, you could say that they were even talking about experts. Kagon Beidina de Rav Huna ude Rav Chista. That you could still throw out a court that's of an expert, like in the case of Rav Huna and Rav Chista. Deka Marle, because he can say to him, Mika matarch nalach, how am I imposing upon you? So now we have to fill that in. So Rav Papa says, no, wait a minute. Rabbi Yochanan, don't go so fast. You could still say that the Mishnah is talking about disallowing entire courts, because it could be the case of Huna and Chista, who, as everybody knows, were both the Rosh Yeshiva in Surah in Babylonia, but even so, the population was so large that while one was the Rosh and one was the student, they were both Dayanim who had their own courts. So there was a court of Huna and Chista in Surah, in Babylonia, operating at the same time, and you could say that Rabbi Elazar, who did not allow the borrower to nullify a court because he can't force the loaner to travel, there's no travel cost. The two courts are across from each other. So the loaner could still cancel, the borrower could still cancel the loaner's court because they're in the same town. For any of the good reasons. Maybe if you just read it in the most open way, for no reason at all, but not the third court.
Could like a superior like Rabbi Yochanan, could he have his own court?
Yes, and he likely did.
And the litigant would have to pick his whole court.
Right, so you have Huna and Chista, who have standing Beit Dins in the same town, operating at the same time, and they're not in conflict with each other. China was actually the prime student of Huna, and when Huna died, Chista became the head of the academy, and
Right,
quotes
so
him often.
That's one. Now, what about the fact that he has the right to pick one judge and then...
So at this point, the Gemara is still working on the assumption that it's the entire court that's being invalidated, not an individual person. So that opening assumption of the Gemara, which none of us agree with, right, is still the running assumption for this level of the Gemara's conversation. That Elazar ben Azariah was talking about a whole court because of the Love Malve issue, which makes sense. He was talking about a whole court. He wasn't getting rid of one court. He wanted to move to another town. That's the context of the Elazar comment, right? So Rabbi Yochanan comes in and says, well, the Elazar comment about moving courts was really about these lousy courts in Syria, not here where we have everybody. But but even so, with a mumche, with an expert court, you wouldn't do that. Rav Papa comes in and says, no, even with an expert court, you might do that because the Elazar thing about moving towns doesn't always apply. What if you're someplace with China and Chista? So Elazar doesn't apply. And you might have this as a mumche and that's not a mumche, or they're both mumchim. And I want to move from one to the other. There's no Elazar reason not to do it. There's no mumche reason not to do it. And I'm still invalidating a mumche court. Rav Papa is saying you could do that.
Yeah, but the Mishnah said this one could pick one, this one could pick one, and this one could pick.
You guys are not going to let go of your first read on the Mishnah. Gemara asks you to say, I'm going to read the Mishnah with this understanding, and now I'm going to stop and I'm going to erase that, and I'm going to have a completely different understanding, and I want to see what comes out of that. One understanding is the Mishnah says, I pick a judge, you pick a judge, we pick a judge. Another understanding is I pick a court, you pick a court, we pick a court. Right? We're still going by the assumption that it means court. It probably doesn't. But we're going to play with that for a little while. Right? And the reason we're playing with that is that it allows us to understand Al-Azhar. It allows us to understand the case of the courts in Syria. It allows us to understand whether an expert affects the case between a borrower and a lender. And it allows us now to raise the question of what if you're in a city with two expert courts and you're trying to invalidate between them. None of that would have been discussed coming off of this Mishnah if I hadn't misunderstood the Mishnah as talking about courts. So I'm going to misunderstand it so I can talk about all that stuff, and then I'm going to probably throw that out and go back and understand it the way you and I both understood it to begin with. And then learn other things. Right? That's what the Gemara does. Yes?
No. I know people in Lakewood and Brooklyn who use monetary things. Do these things still apply? Do they still, I mean, this isn't in Syria or it's in Brooklyn. It's in
Does
Lakewood.
this
They're
law
fighting over
still
money.
apply? This, the Talmudic law in general. She's asking a general relevance of the Talmud question. Does the Talmudic law still apply in our day? When civil law has something to say, the civil law has the power to force its ruling on us, no matter what the Talmud says, unless we are both given the right to sign away our civil rights and determine it by Talmud law, which happens sometimes in traditional circles. So, for the most part, the answer is no, because there's no court case where both people are going to sign away their rights. Because the guys who know enough Talmud to say they want to use the Talmud also know how the Talmud is going to rule. So one of them is not accepting that, right? And they're going to wind up in the civil courts anyways. Right, and you're going to wind up in civil court anyways. However, you should know this is more than a theoretical issue in the land of Israel today. In Medinat Yisrael, there has been a reading of the Knesset. It's not going to pass, I don't think, but there's been a reading, there's been the idea that rather than defaulting to British common law when there's not a law on the books, that Israel's courts should default to Jewish religious law for all matters unless there is a law on the books. Which means if the Knesset has passed a law, that's what you do, and if the Knesset has not passed a law, you do what the Talmud says. That would, in my mind, turn the modern state of Israel largely into a theocracy and give the specific Orthodox rabbinate secular authority over an entire world of affairs. And it would turn Israel into a non-secular state as its basic ethos.
What about the Haredi? They
That's what I'm talking
believe in this.
Yeah, the Haredi, same as you and me. I think most people will say if it's advantageous, I'm in the civil court, and if it's advantageous, I'll be in the religious court, and people make those decisions that way. There's very few places where they just say, we're only going by Talmud law. We're never going to use the civil court.
But there are religious courts in America, too.
Mostly the religious courts in America are dealing with religious affairs and divorces.
Yes.
So they're dealing with kashrut, they're dealing with divorces, they're dealing with maybe adultery or mamzer or that kind of stuff. They're really not dealing with Bitcoin.
No, or monetary matters.
Because you can wind up in the courts anyways, right? All right, so let's, yes.
So I don't know about your case here, but some rabbis' contracts, I've been seeing that disputes would be done by a beit din.
Yes, my contract with the congregation says if we are in dispute, and the only dispute that could possibly happen is, they want to fire me and I don't want to be fired, because nobody keeps a rabbi who wants to quit. That would be dumb, right? So they want to fire me, I don't want to be fired, I still have a contract. That there's a clause that says we will resolve that in the Beit Din of the conservative movement, meaning that we will go to the authorities of the conservative movement, United Synagogue and the Rabbinical Assembly, and we will each bring our case and they'll rule and we'll go by it. That's a binding arbitration clause.
Your point here, how that is still used today, because rabbi contracts.
Right.
Just one quick one. Rav
Yep.
Papa, is he,
Who's Rav Papa?
right.
Okay, so this is a good point to pause and do my historical work. So, the Mishnah was written by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi
Right.
in the year 200. The Gemara, anonymous voice, has been crafting the flow of our argument so far, and that guy's, let's call him the year 600 of the Common Era. I could be off by 100 years before or 200 years later.
600, it was redacted.
Yeah, let's throw that out.
200 was.
This is
No,
BC.
200 is the Mishnah, 600 is the Gemara.
Go ahead.
So the Talmud, CE, of the, no, not BC, CE, Common Era. In our numbers, positive numbers after the non-year zero. Because there was no year zero. It went from -1 to 1. There was no year zero. People, when you're doing math, it's important. Because I have to go and date documents, right? So you can't just subtract and then add the BC numbers. You have to subtract 1 when you're done because there was no year zero.
Okay, come on.
All right. Fair enough. So what happens? So the Mishnah is written in the year 200. The organizer of the Talmudic argument that we are following did that in the year 600. The first person that he brought, isn't that funny? Kansas City, Missouri is calling me.
Not too bad.
No, they don't want me back. It's the funniest thing I've heard in a long time. So the first person he brings in is Elazar ben Azariah, who's from like the year 100. And the next person to interpret Elazar ben Azariah is Yochanan, who's from the year 200. Okay? And then, who's the next person who comes in? Papa. Papa is from the year 350. And he's living in Babylonia. He's an Amora, a student of Rava and Abaye, and he was the head of the Talmudic Academy in Nehardea, which is one of the 3 big yeshivas that generated Talmudic teachings in Babylonia, creating the Babylonian Talmud. Surah, Pumbedita, and Nehardea. Okay? So, he's the Rosh of Nehardea, which is very near Surah, and they all knew each other, and it's about the year 350. So, what's interesting is, if you just read the thing, it says, V'ha'amar Reb Elazar, Kidda Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Papa Amar.
What
Right?
about Rabbi Meir?
Rabbi Meir was back in the Mishnah. But in the Gemara, this section that's studying the Mishnah, it says, Rabbi Elazar said this, and Rabbi Yochanan said that, and Rav Papa says this. None of these guys knew each other.
Of course not.
They couldn't have. They didn't live at the same time. One of them isn't even on the same continent, really. Right? But the Gemara has put them together to talk to each other, to show that the 3 different major teachings over time on the topic of annulling courts are all learned out of this Mishnah or in response to this Mishnah, and they paint a coherent picture. Rav Papa says, even if you say expert judges, for example, the courts of Huna and Chista, who were down the road in Surah, and he can say to him, I can impose upon you. The borrower can say, I impose upon you. So Rav Papa has a study of Rab Elazar. Rab Elazar has this thing about borrowers and loaners. Is the Mishnah talking about borrowers and loaners?
No.
Kind of not, sort of. It says Dine Mamanot. Right? So it starts out, it says in money matters. Well, money matters are what? What can be a money matter? Borrowing, loaning is one.
Sell you something.
Sales, selling is another. What's another?
Salary.
Salary, wages, sure. What's another? Land, fancy word, usufruct, the benefit of the land. You may own the orchard, but I buy the apples, right? It can be documents that have to do with money. It could be theft, right? Or property destruction. All these are money matters. All these are handled in local courts. So Elazar has an issue, Surya has an issue, Papa has a solution. Yochanan tried to limit Elazar, but Papa has a solution, and Papa is based on the original Elazar teaching, right? So what's really going on here? Because Papa is pretty close to the editor of the Talmud. So the editor of the Talmud has the Rav Papa teaching from his hometown that says this Mishnah allows you to knock out local expert courts even in cases of monetary loans. Because Papa did a teaching on Elazar on this Mishnah. Because the editor of the Gemara is from the area of Papa, and he has this teaching, he gave you everything that led up to Papa so you could understand Papa. The things that we have been doing do not help you to understand the Mishnah.
That's right.
They confuse the hell out of the Mishnah. They deliberately misunderstand the Mishnah. They misunderstand the Mishnah on the topic of Rebbe Meir, who doesn't even get the halacha from the Mishnah. Why are we doing this to ourselves, you've been asking yourself for the last hour?
Right.
Because we needed to understand the background of Rav Papa, who is very close in time to the editor of the Gemara.
Okay.
And the Gemara wants you to know Papa in light of this Mishnah. So everything that led up to Papa is the necessary background for Papa, and really is quite artificial as a leaping point from Rebbe Meir. And only when you break it off and you see that he does a historical development of Elazar in the year 100, to Yochanan in the year 200, to Papa in the year 350, and that Papa is referencing Elazar, who was talking about getting rid of courts, and this is the only place anywhere in the Mishnah where you have anything that can talk about somebody getting rid of anybody's court, even though that's not what it's saying. It's closer than anywhere else in the Mishnah. This is where you're going to put the Papa teaching. Okay? So it's an editorial choice with additional material for you to understand it.
Do they look to the Torah to see, to back up their theories? Is there anything in the Torah that says anything about this type of litigation?
In the Torah it says, Al pi shnaim yakum devar, on the basis of two witnesses things will be established. And it says, shoftim v'shotrim yihiyu, in those days you shall have judges and so forth, authorities. And the rabbinic interpretation is to put those commands together and to say, you will have judges in courts of three who will hear the witnesses of two to establish all matters that are contested from the Torah. That's where the system comes from. So, no, but yes. And they would say yes. Okay?
So why don't they quote the Torah and say,
The rabbis really believed in their own authority. They were living Torah. When they quoted Torah, it was very nice, but the fact that one of the rabbis of the Mishnah said something was plenty enough authority. You could go, if you wanted to, the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot that says God gave Torah to Moses at Sinai, Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the, and so on down to the Sanhedrin, who become the rabbis. And the rabbis therefore have a chain of connection to God at Sinai. They don't invoke it very often, but they behave as if they always have it. So now, what's going to happen? And we'll set up next week. So now what's going to happen is Tanan. But we learned in the Mishnah, right?
Right.
Now, again, Aramaic to Hebrew, Tanan, change the taf to a shin, and what do you got? Shanen. And the nun on the end means to us, and it's Shana Otanu.
Oh, us?
And it's from the word Mishnah. Tanan means it is Shana, it is Mishnah. The Mishnah taught us. Every time the word Tanan introduces a quote, it's a quote from this Mishnah or another Mishnah. Not a Baraita, not a Sugya, not a teaching, an actual Mishnah. Chachamim omrim shnei dayanim borim lahen od echad. And now they're going to say, what the heck are you talking about? Mr. Gemara says to Mr. Gemara. The Mishnah says that the sages say two judges select another. So if you wrongly thought that you're talking about a whole Beit Din batar de pasle laho, can a court, after having disqualified Azlu uvararu lahen Beit Din acharina, go and select itself another court? How can you say he has gotten rid of a court and then the court picks another court? Once the court is disqualified, how is it going to pick a court? Right? So it quotes the Chachamim as saying, it's obviously not a court that's being disqualified, which you all understood the first time you read the Mishnah. So now that we learned the Rav Papa, which he really wanted to teach us, we can actually talk about the Mishnah. And we're going to go to the Chachamim, and we're going to get to the correct understanding of the Mishnah, and we're going to move forward from there.
Very good.
Okay?
Yes.
That's today's class.
Thank you.
Excellent.
It's, when you think of,
The interpretation.
I'll say American law, with the